Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. And certainly, entrepreneurship has already come up this morning. We know that entrepreneurship is very important. There are high expectations that entrepreneurship is going to get us out of this mess. And what I want to do in my talk today is talk about some of the realities, but also some of the myths about entrepreneurship, so that we can have a clearer perspective when we're thinking about entrepreneurship, about what it can and what it can't do. First of all, there are a lot of different forms of entrepreneurship, and we have to remember that. We have certainly self-employment. We have a large percentage of people that start their own firms. They never hire anyone. There are some countries, for example, France, they have a law they put in place a couple of years ago called auto-entrepreneur that facilitates people creating their own businesses, and that's the way to help get people off unemployment. But it doesn't create jobs. Basically, it just gets people off unemployment. But self-employment certainly is a form of entrepreneurship. We then have SMEs, and I think in Europe, a lot of people equate SMEs with entrepreneurship, and they think if you're a small, medium-sized enterprise, you're an entrepreneur. The majority of SMEs actually don't want to grow. They play a very important role in the economy. In many countries, SMEs comprise the majority of the economy. However, I think research has shown that more than 60–70% of most SMEs have no interest in growing. So we're not going to get the growth from them. So again, we have to be clear, entrepreneurship is not about size. It's not about small, medium enterprises or about self-employment. We then see this category of high-growth firms, or gazelles as they're called. And we know from research done by OECD, by the Kauffman Foundation, and by many others, that it's these high-growth firms, or these gazelles, which create the majority of jobs and economic growth. So, of course, we want more of these. The reality is that they only form a very small percent of the population, 2 to 5% of the population. And the other reality about them is that the growth changes over time. The growth phases change over time. So we tend to think about high-growth firms, and we think, okay, let's go find them. Everybody's looking for these high-growth firms. And there's an issue of definitions. How are we defining the high-growth firms? But also the phase that they go through. Firms might be high-growth during certain phases and not during others. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of even identifying these high-growth firms. But we know that they're very important, and there's a lot of research and a growing body of research in this area. In fact, Albert from Nesta, along with some of my colleagues at the OECD, they've done some work looking at firm dynamics and high-growth firms across countries and trying to understand what it is that encourages the growth of these high-growth firms. And I just wanted to quote some of the data just to give you some reference in terms of Spain from that work and from the database that Albert has put together. In Spain, high-growth firms are 6% of the market in terms of the number of firms, and they're 5% in terms of the number of employees. However, in terms of job creation, they create about 45% of the jobs. So, again, we can see the contribution that these high-growth firms play. The other thing, and this is based on Kauffman Foundation financed work that was done a number of years ago, it's not just the high-growth firms, but it's, and of course, as I mentioned before, it's not about the size of firms. It's also about the age of firms. Kauffman research has shown that firms under 5 years old between 1980 and 2005 were responsible for nearly all net new job creation. So it's young firms, not small firms. It's young, growth-oriented firms that we need. And this is not to be confused with youth entrepreneurship. I was at a recent OECD meeting, and this point was made about the important role of young firms. And then the moderator summarized and said, yes, these young entrepreneurs. Well, there's a big difference. I mean, actually, Kauffman research and other research done in Europe as well shows that the average age of entrepreneurs is over 40. So, we have this perception that entrepreneurs are 20-something, starting a company in a garage with their dog, and, they become the Facebook and the Googles, but that is not the reality. That is the exception, not the rule. And the majority of these people are much older, and also they're highly skilled. Research has shown, the various studies have shown that these are high-skilled, people that start later, that start these companies later. And many of them might have tried to start companies when they were younger as well. It is important to get young people to think about entrepreneurship and to experiment and go out and try to start a company. But the reality is it's not the youth entrepreneurs that are going to be creating the jobs, and we have to keep that in mind. In terms of creating more high-growth firms, so we know that high-growth firms are important. We know we want more of them, and so how do we create them? Well, that's a big question. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. There is no one-size-fits-all. But there's been a lot of talk, especially recently, about entrepreneurial ecosystems and a lot of interest in how do we create these entrepreneurial ecosystems. We were just talking actually at breakfast about this. And in Europe, they're trying to create ecosystems in different areas, and everyone's trying to copy the Silicon Valley. And what we have to keep in mind is the Silicon Valley developed over many, many decades. And same with the phenomenon around MIT, and same with the phenomenon around University of Cambridge in the UK. And it was not from top-down measures. It was from bottom-up actions. And it was not from going in and building incubators and infrastructure. It was about the social networks of the people that are in these ecosystems. There's a study that was done by the University of Cambridge, which I really like, which mapped all of the spin-outs from the University of Cambridge. But what's different about what they didn't just look at the companies that spun out. They looked at the entrepreneurs behind these companies, and then they looked at the social relationships, the working relationships between these people. And they found thick networks between some of the key players, Herman Hauser and other people in Cambridge. And it was these people that really developed this entrepreneurial ecosystem, this environment of trust and people working together and having experience and going out and trying something else. So, again, we have to be careful about trying to come in and create an ecosystem. Certainly there are things that can be done to help facilitate it, but it can't be created, and you need the right factors. In fact, the Kauffman Foundation, Bob Lighton and I were holding a international research and policy roundtable in March of this year, and the topic of ecosystems was on the agenda. And we talked about this issue of top-down versus bottom-up. And the consensus from the experts that we had in the room, actually, was that these things almost happen by accident. It's not that someone planned it. It evolved over time because of a set of factors that were in the environment and because of some of the key people that played an important role connecting the different players in the ecosystem. So what is the role of the public sector and the private sector in terms of entrepreneurship? We know we want more entrepreneurship to create jobs. We need all kinds of entrepreneurship. We need self-employed people, we need SMEs, but we also need these high-growth firms. So what should the public sector do? What can the private sector do? In terms of the public sector, we already discussed this morning the importance of dealing with some of the framework conditions, addressing some of the regulatory and administrative barriers, and we talked about labor laws and things like that this morning. We also talked a little bit about access to finance, and Joel pointed out that it's important to have a vibrant financial system. This is, we've seen from various research studies the important role that that plays in terms of entrepreneurship. But what's important there is where the sources of money are coming from. And I think you alluded to this, but what we see, especially in Europe, is that there's a lot of public money that's going into entrepreneurship, into trying to finance these young firms. In fact, I was alarmed when I looked at EVCA data recently, and the largest institutional investor in private equity and venture capital in Europe, it's not the pension funds or the banks, it's the governments. So I think we have to be really careful. We do need more access to finance. We need more finance for entrepreneurs. But we need to leverage private money. And the role of the public sector is to create incentives to leverage private money, not to replace private money and crowd out the market, because that's never going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. I just finished for the OECD a book on financing high-growth firms that looks primarily at angel financing, but also looks at venture capital. But it talks about this trade-off between public and private money and incentives that are needed. However, as Louisa said earlier, it's not just about money. If you ask entrepreneurs, of course they'll tell you, oh, it's because we need money. But that is not the big issue, and I completely agree with Louisa. It really is about culture. and this fear of failure. And certainly bankruptcy laws, corporate and personal bankruptcy laws can help solve part of that, but the problem is much deeper in terms of the fear of failure. People might have negative perceptions about entrepreneurship, or they might not have had role models. They might not think it's the right thing to do, or it's a cool thing to do. So we really have to change the culture about entrepreneurship and the perceptions about entrepreneurship. And that leads me to the final point, that education plays a very, very important role. If we're going to change mindsets, it's going to take a generation. It's not going to happen overnight. And we need to start in the education system. We have to start at a young level through higher education. At higher education, it's already too late even. So we need to think about how we're training people and really reform the education system. As we discussed earlier, and we're going to hear more from Peter in a few minutes, the education systems are not suited to the current economy and to the jobs that are out there, neither to help people become entrepreneurs, nor to help prepare them for the jobs that are there. So we really need to make a radical change in education, and the question is how we do that, and hopefully we can pick up on that later. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I was going to just say a few words about innovation, or I'll stop there.
One more minute.
Okay. That's in terms of entrepreneurship and some of the myths and realities about entrepreneurship, but also with innovation. Innovation is a very hot word right now at the moment too. And one thing that came out of the OECD innovation strategy is that a lot of countries think that innovation equals R&D, because that's what you can measure. But innovation is not just about R&D, it's much broader than that. And if we only limit it to thinking about R&D, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's a big, important issue. The other thing is innovation and R&D and other forms of innovation by itself does not create companies and jobs. We need entrepreneurs that can translate innovation into jobs. And the final point I'll make is that often the policymakers responsible for innovation policy are very different from the ones responsible for entrepreneurship policy. And often there's absolutely no coordination between the two sets of policies. And this is a problem as well. So I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.